The drawing room at Ashmore Park held 32 people on the evening of the 6th of November, and Louisa Fenwick was not among them. She was beside them. She stood at the far edge of the room near the sideboard, a tray balanced in her hands, and she moved when she was needed, and was still when she was not. The candles burned in their silver brackets. The fire in the marble hearth had been built up high, and the room smelled of beeswax and the faint sweetness of hothouse roses someone had arranged in a vase she would later carry back to the kitchen. The silk chairs were occupied, the silk dresses rustled, and at the center of it all, Lady Dorothea Prentice stood with her back to the fire and her ivory fan at the precise angle she favored, and said to the room at large that this evening would conclude with an announcement of particular happiness. Louisa set a cup and saucer in front of Mrs. Whitfield without making a sound. She had been at Ashmore Park for 6 months. She knew the weight of every tray and the names of every guest, and the particular way Lady Prentice's chin rose when she was about to say something that was meant to wound. She knew the layout of the house in the dark. She knew which floorboard outside the library creaked, and which hinge on the study door had been loose since September, and which of the upper maids could be trusted, and which could not. She knew all of this, because knowing things was what she did. Her father, who had been an apothecary and a reader of Latin and a keeper of very precise accounts, had taught her that knowledge was the only currency the world could not confiscate. The Marquess of Ashmore stood at the edge of the assembled company and watched none of it. He stood near the tall windows that looked out over the park, his back half turned to the room, a glass of wine he had not touched held at his side. He was 37 years old. He was broad-shouldered and dark-haired, that particular dark auburn that candlelight turned to something very nearly copper, and he had a faint diagonal scar through his left brow from a riding fall he had taken in his youth. His eyes, when he chose to use them, were gray-green and very still. He was not a man who showed what he was thinking. He was not even, particularly, a man who appeared to think. He appeared, instead, to have already resolved every question and to be waiting, with a patience that did not require the reassurance of display, for the rest of the room to catch up. Lady Prentice said, to the room and to no one in particular, "Of course, it has always been my hope that Ashmore would make a suitable arrangement. A house requires a mistress. The Fenwick girl was enough trouble for one season, trespassing where she ought not." Louisa did not move. She felt the words land the way she had learned to feel such things. Not in the face where they would show, but in the chest, where they settled. The Fenwick girl. It was not a new name. She had been the Fenwick girl since her first week here. When Lady Prentice had come down to the kitchen passage for the sole purpose of making clear that the position was a favor, and that favors were conditional. The 2 gold sovereigns were in her apron pocket. They were always in her apron pocket. That was where it had begun. 6 months ago, in September, when the estate grounds were still green, and the mornings were still warm enough to walk without a shawl, Louisa had been sent to the churchyard at the edge of the park to clip the grass around a particular headstone. It was not a task usually assigned to a housemaid, but the groundskeeper had twisted his ankle, and Mrs. Holt had looked at the list of what needed doing, and looked at Louisa and said, in the brisk, economical voice she used for all communication, "You'll manage it. You're not delicate." It was not a compliment, but Louisa had learned to take what was offered. The churchyard was old. The stones were gray and lichen-patterned and tilted at their various angles, and the yew trees along the east wall were very dark and very still in the morning light. She found the headstone she had been sent to tend, knelt beside it, and began her work. The inscription said only, "Marian, Marchioness of Ashmore, beloved." 1791 to 1812. She had been 21 years old. Louisa heard him before she saw him. A footstep on the path, measured and unhurried. She did not look up, because it was not her place to look up, but she moved slightly to make room. Then she heard the sound he made, and her hands went still. It was not a loud sound. It was the opposite of loud. It was the kind of sound a man makes when he has held something inside himself for a very long time, and the vessel has developed, at last, a single small crack. She looked up then, because she was human, and because no person with any charity in them could have done otherwise. He was standing at the head of the grave. His hat was in his hand. His head was bowed. And the Marquess of Ashmore, who was by all accounts the coldest man in 3 counties, was weeping. Quietly, without theater, without any apparent awareness that he was not entirely alone. His shoulders did not shake. His face did not contort. He simply stood with his head bowed and his hat in his hand, and wept in the manner of a man who has had a great deal of practice at grief, and has never once found it easier. Louisa discovered, to her considerable inconvenience, that she was weeping too. She pressed her fist to her mouth. She made no sound. She was behind the yew hedge, and he had not seen her, and she calculated that if she remained perfectly still, she might emerge from this encounter with her position intact. He saw her. She did not know how. She made no sound. He raised his head and turned and looked directly at the gap in the hedge where she knelt, and the expression on his face in that moment was one she had never seen on any person of rank. It was not anger. It was not disdain. It was the unguarded face of a man who has been seen in a moment he was not prepared to be seen in, and who does not yet know what that means. He crossed the churchyard to her. He reached into his coat. He held out 2 gold sovereigns, and his hand was perfectly steady, and his voice, when he spoke, was very quiet and very even. "You will forget this," he said. Louisa looked at the coins in his palm. She looked at his face, and then she did the only thing her father's teaching had ever prepared her for, which was the precise and inconvenient thing. She shook her head. "I will not take money for silence," she said, "but you have my silence, if it matters to you, without condition." He stood very still. He looked at her for a long moment, in the way a man looks at a document that says something he had not expected it to say. Then he closed his fingers around the sovereigns, and turned and walked back up the path to the house, and Louisa knelt in the grass beside the grave of his young wife, and finished clipping the hedge, because the work still needed doing. She thought about those 2 sovereigns a great deal in the months that followed, not because she regretted refusing them, and she did not, but because they seemed to her to mark the specific moment she had become something she had not been before, a person the Marquess of Ashmore had been unable to predict. If you have ever watched a man of rank be surprised, you know how rarely it happens. If you have watched him try to account for it afterward, you know how rarely he succeeds. The autumn deepened, and the house went on. Ashmore Park was not a warm house, but it was a competent one. Mrs. Holt ran the domestic staff with the precision of a woman who had learned early that the alternative to precision was chaos, and who preferred precision. The maids moved through their rotations. The fires were built and banked and built again. The Marquess arrived for dinner and departed after, and was not seen again until the following afternoon, when he might appear in the library or walk the grounds or summon his steward, Mr. Prescott, for conference in the study that could last 2 hours. He did not speak to Louisa. She had not expected that he would. She was a housemaid. She had briefly been the woman who had witnessed a moment he wished had not occurred. She assumed he had filed her away under the heading of managed inconveniences and moved on. She was mistaken. But she did not know it yet. She watched him the way she watched everything she was not supposed to be interested in, which was to say carefully and without apparent purpose. He rose before 7. He walked the grounds before breakfast in all weathers, which the groundskeeper took as a mark of the Marquess's severity, and which Louisa, watching him return once with his coat damp and his face cleared of the particular tightness it wore in company, thought might simply be the only hour in which he was left alone. He ate alone. He met with Mr. Prescott on Tuesdays. He did not attend the assemblies at Gretford, which Lady Prentice pressed upon him every autumn in the manner of a woman who believed that repetition would, eventually, succeed where persuasion had failed. He read. This surprised her, though she could not have said why. She had known, abstractly, that the library was his, in the way all rooms in a great house belong ultimately to their owner. She had not expected to arrive at the upper shelves on a Tuesday morning and find the reading chairs below in evident use, a volume of Herodotus closed on the table beside 1.5 burned candle in the holder to its left. The candle was cold. He had been there in the night. She finished the shelves and went downstairs and said nothing about it, which was not difficult, because no one asked. The Fenwick girl, Mrs. Holt said to the kitchen one morning, in the particular tone she used when she was reporting a fact and not offering an opinion, is to be kept off the library rotation for the foreseeable future. She looked at Louisa as she said it, and her expression was not unkind, merely practical. His lordship's orders. Louisa nodded and said she understood. She did not understand, but she said she did. Because that was also a thing her father had taught her, and that was that understanding and compliance were two entirely different operations. The library. She had not thought the library would matter. She had visited it twice in 6 weeks, to dust the upper shelves, and she had allowed herself the small treason of reading the titles as she moved along them, which was the only reading she could afford. The library at Ashmore Park held 4,000 volumes. She had noted in passing that 3 of them were in Latin. He had excluded her from the room she was most likely to be caught reading in. The thought sat with her in a way she did not quite know what to do with. November came in gray and cold, and the announcement of Lady Prentice's gathering reached the household through the usual channels, which meant through Mrs. Holt, who relayed the guest list with the expression of a woman who had been asked to choreograph a performance she found aesthetically objectionable. 32 guests. 4 days. The objective, as the household understood it without anyone requiring it to be stated, was the presentation of Miss Honoria Vale as a candidate for the position of the next Marchioness of Ashmore. Louisa had seen Miss Vale in the autumn, briefly, when the young woman had called with her mother. She was not an unkind person. She was polished and precise, with copper gold hair and very good gloves, and she had the particular expression of someone who had been told her entire life that she was the correct choice, and had chosen to believe it. She was probably right to believe it. She had rank and income and bearing, and a mother who had been friends with Lady Prentice for 30 years. Louisa thought about this in the evenings, in the small room at the top of the back stairs that she had made as orderly as she could manage, and told herself that the thought produced no feeling in her whatsoever. She was, in this, also mistaken. The evidence accumulated in the specific way that evidence accumulates when one is trying not to notice it. He asked Mr. Prescott, one Tuesday, whether the late apothecary Fenwick had been known in Gretford before his ruin. Mr. Prescott said he had not been aware of the man. The Marquess said, in the mild and unhurried tone he used when he was asking something that mattered to him. He was educated, more than his means might suggest. Mr. Prescott agreed that this was sometimes the case with men of that class. The Marquess said nothing further, but Louisa, who had been carrying the coal scuttle past the study door and who had no business knowing any of this, knew it. He left a volume of Pope's translation of the Iliad on the library table one morning. Open. At a marked page. Louisa, who had been instructed to dust the room, stood for some time looking at it before she closed it carefully and replaced it on the shelf, precisely where it had been before, which was nowhere near where it had come from. She did not read it. She nearly did. She told herself she had not read it because it was not hers to read. She told herself this with the confidence of a woman who has told herself something that is not entirely true and has decided it will have to do. Then her cousin Aldous came. Aldous Fenwick was 3 years older than Louisa and had always had the particular quality of a man whose opportunities had never quite matched his sense of what he deserved. He arrived on a Wednesday in a hired gig and sent a note up to the kitchen that he wished to see his cousin, and would she be so good as to meet him at the gate. She met him at the gate. Ja, see. There are things a man in my position requires, Aldous said without preamble. He had the family mouth, precise and determined, but he used it very differently than she did. You're well placed. The Marquess is a private man. Information about a private man has a value. I have no information, Louisa said. You have access, Aldous said, which is the same thing, with patience. It is not the same thing. Louisa? No, she said. She said it the way she said most things that needed saying, which was quietly and without emphasis, because emphasis was for people who were uncertain they had been understood. No, Aldous. Go home. He went eventually. He was not a brave man, only a hungry one. Louisa walked back up the drive in the cold and thought about her father's accounts, which had been so precise, and about the debt that had undone them, and about the fact that she could have taken Aldous's money just as she could have taken the Marquess's sovereigns, and that she had not, and that she had nothing to show for it except the unchanged state of her own conscience, which was not, she acknowledged, a very comfortable form of currency. She was in the under-butler's room that evening, reading, when she became aware that she was not alone. Mr. Marsh had been ill for a fortnight. He was 63 years old and had served at Ashmore since he was 17. And the physician said it was a fever that would pass if he was kept warm and quiet. The kitchen maid who usually sat with him had twisted her ankle. Louisa, on her way past, had looked at the man lying in his narrow bed, with his eyes closed and his breathing labored, and had gone in and sat down. She had a small volume of Virgil she had taken from her father's collection when the rest was sold. She opened it and read aloud. Not translating. Reading in Latin, because it was how she knew it, and because she thought perhaps the sound of it might be a comfort, even if the words were opaque. She read slowly. The room was warm. Mr. Marsh's breathing steadied. She was in the 4th book when she had the sensation of being observed. She looked up. The Marquess of Ashmore stood in the doorway of the under-butler's room. He had his coat on and his gloves in his hand, as if he had come in from outside and passed this room by chance. His gray-green eyes were fixed on her with an expression she could not readily name. He was very still. He had been still for some time, she thought. The cold air from outside had faded from around him. The candle on the table beside Mr. Marsh's narrow bed had burned a 1/4 inch lower since she had begun reading, which meant that the Marquess had been standing there for rather longer than he would perhaps have liked her to know. She rose. She closed the book. Her hands were steady because she had learned, in 6 months of this house, that unsteady hands were read by everyone in them. I was only reading, she said. I know, he said. His voice was quiet. He looked at the book in her hand. "Virgil. The fourth book, my lord." "Dido," he said. "Yes." He looked at Mr. Marsh, whose breathing was easier than it had been this morning, and whose face had settled into the particular stillness of a man who is sleeping rather than suffering. Then he looked at Louisa again. The expression on his face was not quite decipherable. It had the quality of a man who has just added something to an internal account that he had not expected to be adding to. He said it then. "Sit down, Miss Fenwick. He needs the reading more than he needs the propriety." She sat. He left. At the end of the corridor she heard him stop, and she thought, though she could not be certain, that he stood there for the duration of another full minute before she heard his footsteps resume and move away. She also thought, though she permitted herself the thought only briefly. He knew which book of the Aeneid the fourth book was. Not every man of rank knew that. Not every man of any rank paused in a corridor in the dark to listen to a housemaid read Virgil in Latin to a sick servant. These facts did not add up to anything she was prepared to name. They simply sat in her mind the way facts sit before one knows what they mean. 3 days after that, the library rotation was restored. There are people in the world who receive a kindness and cannot rest until they have understood it. Louisa was one of those people. She turned the restored rotation over in her mind, the way she had turned over the refused sovereigns, looking for the logic. He was not a charitable man in the conventional sense. He did not perform generosity for an audience. He had banished her from the library because something about her presence there disquieted him. And he had restored the privilege because something had shifted in the calculation. She thought about what had shifted. She thought about a man reading a woman reading Virgil to a sick servant, without judgment or display. She thought that he was watching for something, and he has perhaps found a piece of it. If this was a dangerous thought, she did not permit herself to say so. The gathering began on the 3rd of November. The guests arrived in their carriages and were received by Lady Prentice in the entrance hall, and Miss Vale arrived in the second carriage of the second afternoon, with her mother beside her, and a traveling trunk that suggested she planned to stay. The Marquess received them all with the formal economy that served him for warmth. Miss Vale smiled at him, and he inclined his head and said, correctly, that it was a pleasure. Louisa, passing with a tray, did not look at his face. She looked at the floor, which was her proper object, and continued to the drawing room, and set down the tray, and retrieved the empty one, and returned to the kitchen. That evening, the Marquess came to find her. He did not send for her. He did not pass a message through Mrs. Holt. He came down the back passage himself, in his shirt sleeves, which she had never seen. And he knocked on the door of the linen room where she was pressing a tablecloth. And when she opened the door, he stepped inside and closed it, and stood against it with his arms at his sides. "I want to tell you something," he said. She set down the iron. "My lord." "About the churchyard." He looked at the wall just to her left, the way people look when they are addressing something inside themselves rather than the person in front of them. "About why I went there every September. About what you were not supposed to know." The room was very quiet. The fire in the grate was burning down. "Marian was 21 when she died," he said. "I had been her husband for 2 years. It was not a marriage of choice on either side. She was frightened of me. I did not understand at the time that she was frightened. I thought her silence was equanimity. I thought her stillness was contentment." He stopped. "She was not content. She was afraid, and I was too certain of my own reading of her to see it." Louisa said nothing. "She took out the mare I had forbidden her," he said. "In a storm. She told no one where she was going. The horse fell at the wall beyond the eastern field." A pause. I cannot tell you that she was going anywhere in particular. I can only tell you that she was going away from the house. The silence that followed was the kind that demands nothing. I have told no one this, he said. I will not tell it again. No, Louisa said. You will not need to. He looked at her then. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the churchyard, with the same unguarded quality, the same willingness to be seen. Or perhaps not willingness, she thought, but a kind of exhausted surrender to the fact that she had already seen him, and that the pretense of concealment was, with her alone, more trouble than it was worth. You returned the sovereigns, he said. Yes. No one has ever returned anything of mine that I offered, he said. It was instructive. He left. She stood in the linen room with her hands clasped in front of her and listened to his footsteps on the back stairs, and did not examine too closely what she felt, because some things, when examined, become too large to manage. Perhaps you know that feeling, the sense that a door has opened somewhere in a house you thought you knew every room of. Stay with it. Lady Prentice escalated on the 4th of November. She called Louisa to the small morning room after breakfast, under the pretext of inquiring about the state of the silver. She sat in the chair by the window with her fan at the established angle, and looked at Louisa as if she were a figure in an account that would not balance. I have been patient, Lady Prentice said, because patience is what this position requires of me. I will tell you plainly that I am aware of certain irregularities in your conduct. You have been seen in rooms you have no business occupying. You have been noted by members of the household as having conversations above your station. And Lord Edgware, who was here last week and who sees a great deal more than people give him credit for, tells me that your cousin was at the gate and that the nature of his visit was not domestic. Louisa waited. The Fenwick girl, Lady Prentice said, and now her voice had the particular quality of someone who is naming a category rather than a person, has been given a great deal more latitude than her position warrants. That latitude will be withdrawn. Do I make myself understood? Yes, my lady, Louisa said. Tonight I am making an announcement of some consequence. You will attend, you will serve. You will not be in evidence in any other capacity. Louisa carried the empty tray back to the kitchen and stood for a moment at the window over the yard. The sky was low and flat. The trees were stripped. Lord Edgware had been watching. The cousin's visit had been noted, and tonight, Lady Prentice would announce the Marquess's intention to offer for Miss Vale, and Louisa would stand at the sideboard and carry the cups and saucers and her 2 gold sovereigns in her apron pocket. And the thing she had not named to herself would be placed quietly in the category of things that were never going to happen. The Marquess appeared in the doorway of the kitchen. He did not come into rooms that he did not intend to fill. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. Stay inside today, he said. Do not go to the gate. Do not receive visitors. I am telling you this, not as an order, but as a request, and I recognize the distinction matters to you. She looked at him. He looked back. You are asking me to trust you, she said. I am asking you to trust that I have not forgotten what you refused, he said. He left. That was the hardest moment. Not the evening to come, though the evening was hard enough. The hardest moment was standing in the kitchen after he had gone, with his words still in the air and the sovereign still in her pocket, and choosing to stay. The drawing room filled in the early evening. The candles were lit, and the fire was built, and the 32 guests settled into their chairs, and Louisa moved among them with her tray, and Lady Prentice stood with her back to the fire. Miss Vale sat near the window. She was dressed in pale gold this evening, which was very becoming, and she held her fan in the manner of a woman who had been told she was the correct choice and had made her peace with accepting it. Mr. Prescott, the solicitor, stood near the door. He was a small, quiet man in a dark coat, and he had arrived this afternoon in a post-chaise, and no one had explained to Louisa what he was doing there. Lady Prentice opened the gathering with the ease of a woman who had been running rooms like this one for 4 decades. She spoke of the season, of Ashmore's importance as an estate, of the pleasure of gathering those who mattered most to the family in one place. She spoke at some length of the particular happiness she anticipated in the announcement she was about to make. Then she paused, and she turned and looked directly at Louisa. "Before I proceed," Lady Prentice said, "I feel it only right to address a matter that has been brought to my attention by more than one party in this room." Her voice was very composed. Her fan remained at its exact angle. "There is a member of the household staff, a girl recently employed, and without particular qualifications, who witnessed a private episode on the estate grounds in September. A sensitive episode, and it has come to my understanding that rather than maintain the discretion her position requires, she has used that knowledge as a means of insinuating herself into rooms and conversations she has no business occupying." The room was very quiet. "The Fenwick girl," Lady Prentice said, and the precision of her diction was absolute, "has made herself useful in a manner that has little to do with housekeeping." 32 people turned and looked at Louisa. She did not set the tray down. She held it with both hands, and she kept her face still, the way her father had taught her to keep it. When the debt collector came, and the question was how much it would cost them this time, she could not defend herself without saying what she had seen. She could not say what she had seen without exposing the specific grief of a specific man to the assessment of a room that would not be kind to it. The accusation was, in its construction, perfect. It assumed she had used his vulnerability, which meant that defending her silence required demonstrating his vulnerability, which was exactly the trap. She said nothing. The room waited. Lady Prentice waited. Miss Vale's fan made one small, contained movement. The Marquess of Ashmore crossed the room. He did not cross it quickly. He crossed it with the particular pace of a man who has decided something and is in no hurry, because the decision is already made, and the only remaining question is the exact manner of its execution. He crossed from the window to the center of the room, and people moved for him the way people move for authority, not because they choose to, but because the body understands rank before the mind does. He stopped in front of Louisa. He reached out and took the tray from her hands. He set it on the sideboard behind him. He turned back. Then he turned to face the room, and his face was the face she had seen in the churchyard, the one without armor. Lady Prentice had begun to speak again, something about the arrangement with Miss Vale, about the announcement she had prepared. "I have already made my offer," the Marquess said. His voice was very level. She declined. "I have not." The room did not move. Lady Prentice's fan stopped. He turned back to Louisa. He reached into his coat pocket. He held out his hand, and in his palm were 2 gold sovereigns. "These belong to you," he said. "They have been in my keeping since September. I believed at the time that you had made an error in refusing them. I have since revised that assessment considerably." She looked at the sovereigns. She looked at his face. "I did not want your money," she said. Her voice was steady. "I wanted nothing from you." "I know," he said. "That is precisely the point." Mr. Prescott, near the door, cleared his throat with the modest authority of a solicitor who has been waiting for his cue. He produced a document. He said, in the mild and efficient manner of a man who had prepared a great many documents and found their preparation largely self-explanatory, that he had been asked to draw up certain papers on behalf of Lord Ashmore, which it would be his pleasure to witness this evening. Lady Prentice found her voice. It came out in pieces. She said something about the arrangement. She said something about Miss Vale. She said something about what was proper. The words were the right words individually, but they had lost their architecture, the way a building loses its authority when the cornerstone is pulled. Around the room, the 32 guests made the small adjustments that people make when the landscape changes beneath them. Mrs. Whitfield set down her cup. Colonel Harley turned very slightly in his chair. The two young women nearest the fire looked at each other with the particular expression of people who understand that they are witnessing something that will be spoken of for years, and are not yet certain what they are permitted to say about it. Miss Vale rose quietly from her chair by the window. She was a composed and graceful young woman, and she made her withdrawal with an ease that suggested she had always known this moment was possible, and had decided, some time ago, what she would do when it arrived. She crossed to where her mother sat and touched her gloved hand to her mother's, and her mother rose with her, and they made their exit through the far door, which had been left open, and the room watched them go with the particular respectful silence that it offers to people who conduct themselves with grace in difficult circumstances. She was not a villain. She was simply not the right conclusion to this particular story, and she had the good sense to recognize it. Lady Prentice sat down. Her fan was closed in her lap. The ivory stick lay still. She looked at the Marquess, and then she looked at Louisa, and the thing that moved across her face in that moment was not concession, precisely, but it was adjacent to it, the expression of a woman who has built a careful argument and watched the foundation shift, and who is trying, with some dignity, to find the angle at which she might say that she had understood this all along. It was a very human expression. Louisa did not gloat at it. The niche did not ask for gloating. It asked only for the recognition to land, and for the person who received it to bear it, with whatever grace they possessed. The room breathed. Louisa looked at the 2 gold sovereigns in his palm. She picked up one of them. She closed her fingers around it. She kept it. He kept the other. They did not speak again that evening in any public way. There were papers. There was Mr. Prescott. There was the particular procedural hush of a thing being made official in the way of the period, which was to say slowly and with great care for the forms that governed how things were done. The guests dispersed. The candles burned lower. The fire in the marble hearth worked its way through the last of its fuel and settled into coals, and someone opened a window, and the cold air of early November came in and moved through the room like a small and purposeful reckoning with everything that had been too warm. Louisa carried the tray back to the kitchen. She washed the cups. She stacked them in their order. She turned down the lamps. She went up the back stairs to her small room, and she sat on the edge of the bed, and she held the sovereign in her closed fist. And she did not cry, because she was not a woman who cried easily. But she sat there for a long time in the dark. In the weeks that followed, there was the business of what came next, which was always there when one life ends and another begins. Lady Prentice withdrew to the dower house at the edge of the park with the dignity of a woman who has not precisely been defeated, but who has been asked to take a different room in the house. She was not cruel about it. She was formal and composed, and she said, once, to Mrs. Holt, that she supposed the girl had qualities she had not been in a position to observe. Mrs. Holt relayed this to Louisa without comment, which was, from Mrs. Holt, approximately equivalent to a benediction. Aldous Fenwick did not come back to the gate. Mr. Marsh recovered. December came in hard and cold, and Ashmore Park prepared for the change that was coming to it, which was the change of a house that has been managed and is about to be lived in again. On an evening in the second week of December, Louisa sat in the study, not behind the desk, which was his. She sat in the chair beside the fire with the Virgil open on her lap. The fire was good. The snow outside the window was doing the particular thing that snow in December does, which is to make everything outside it seem very far away, and everything inside it seem precisely the right size. He came in at 9. He set his coat on the chair. He looked at the book in her lap. "The 4th book," she said. "Still." He sat in the chair across from her, the way he had been sitting across from her in various rooms for months now, always at the exact distance that acknowledged what was between them without assuming a thing about it. "I keep finding passages I had not noticed before," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He said her name. "Miss Fenwick." She looked at him. He reached into his breast pocket. He set the remaining gold sovereign on the table between them. She looked at it, and then she took the one she had kept for 6 weeks from her own pocket and set it beside the first one. They sat on the table in the firelight, 2 old coins exactly alike. One his, and one hers, and each of them meaningless, and each of them the whole of what had passed between them from September to December, from a churchyard and a refusal to a December study and a fire built high. He reached across the table. He picked up her sovereign. He closed it into her fist. She looked at his hand around hers. She felt the warmth of it, specific and complete. "You told me," she said, "that you had not forgotten what I refused." "I have not," he said. "Then you know," she said, "that I do not accept things because they are offered, only because they are true." He looked at her for a long moment with the gray-green eyes that had been watching her since September, and then he did something she had not seen him do in any room, in any company, in any of the months she had been at Ashmore. He smiled. It was a small thing. It was a 3 seconds thing. It remade the entire room. "Yes," he said, "I am beginning to understand that about you." Outside the study window, the snow went on falling in its patient way, and the sovereign in her hand was warm, and the fire was good, and the 4th book of the Aeneid lay open on the arm of the chair, and the house around them settled into the particular quiet of a place that has made up its mind. If you stayed until the end of this story, leave a word in the quiet below about the moment that stayed with you. They are a comfort. Those words, more than you may know. The sovereign stayed in her hand. The other stayed in his, and that was the whole of it, and it was enough.